So how many of you ever heard of a book called Situational Ethics? So I was in grade school in the 1960s, and so how many of you were in grade school in the 1960s? So situational ethics begins to form the foundation of what you and I were taught. And so situational ethics by a guy named Fletcher basically says, we'll find, whatever works within the situation to define what is a moral kind of thought. And so character education gives way to this sort of thing. A guy by the name of Alan Bloom in 1987 writes a book called The Closing of the American Mind. And by then, the term value relativism had basically managed to work itself into the system following on from the situational ethics. And so we begin to see all these things coming along. In fact, how many of you in grade school read the Basil Reader's C-Spot Run? So one of the things that then happened was that in the 1980s, a newspaper article in I believe it was the New York Times says, as the debate goes on, growing numbers of schools are trying to replace the Basil Readers with books that contain really interesting stories. Some schools are even going so far as to dust off the McGuffey's Eclectic Readers, first published almost 150 years ago in 1836. Sales of those manuals with old but often great stories rose from about 10,000 in 1975 to 217,000 last year, according to a report in the November issue of the Smithsonian Institute. So people began to recognize that these things were not really very interesting to read, and certainly we're not teaching any sort of moral education.
What's his last name?
Josh McDowell.
McDowell.
Yes, and so he wrote a book called The Last Christian Generation, and in which he has a conversation where he says, my kids and I are using the same words, but we have totally different meanings.
Yes.
And so he's fearful that we are losing this generation because we're talking past each other. Even though we're using the same words, they aren't the same meaning. I, all the time, stop and I ask my students, if I use a word, I ask them, what does that word mean? What does the word premise mean? And I have to make sure that we all know what that word is before I go on to talk about the use of the premise.